Dit is donderdag die 14de Maart. Ons gaan aan met The Long Lost Grave. 3 very strong brandies, he announced, looking from the one to the other. And there must be a very good reason for it, Rob grunted. There sure is. Grab a seat and we'll get down to business. Okay, Kathy, he started when Herbie was seated. You want to know what this craziness is all about and why these men are so anxious to find the liberty. He silenced Herbie with a hand. I assure you it has nothing to do with a book, but with this. He placed the large and glimmering gold coin on the table between them. Kathy gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. Is it gold? She whispered in awe, touching it gingerly with one finger. Rob nodded solemnly. It's gold, from the Liberty. Herbie stared at them, stupefied. He didn't understand the reason for the breach of security, but he suspected that something important had come up, or Rob had gone crazy. How do you know that? Kathy dubiously asked. Rob didn't answer, but stood up and fetched the logbook, photocopies and photographs from the trunk. Suddenly or silently, he placed it in front of her. There it is, all the proof you need. The Liberty carried gold, and we're not the only ones who know about it. But you are the only one who knows where she went down, and that's why they are so persistent to get the position from you. Herbie was over the initial shock. You mean, he asked, dazzled, you found the wreck of the Liberty and afterwards wrote to the library for information? She nodded. Yes. Only they replied that there was nothing. And then Johnson arrived and now this. She was suddenly frightened, watching them with a grave expression. What's going to happen now? Wait, first we must throw all our knowledge together, Rob advised soberly. Every bit of it, and then try to fathom who or what is against us. I'm certain they know all about us. They know about you. But how they are connected to each other and how they got onto us, we don't know. So let's talk this through. And the three of them talked until late in the night. They exchanged knowledge, made deductions from the letters, the library's false information, and came to the conclusion that Bailey stood slam bang in the middle of it. He had to have known about Herbie and the coin, handled the photocopies, and answered Kathy's letter, deliberately misleading. The subsequent meeting with Selina Naudé, the ransacking of the apartment, and her inquiring call to Kathy somehow linked the two together. Gordon Forbes and Johnson tied up well, and the first mentioned had probably received Kathy's letter from Bailey. This tied the lot in the opposition together. So it started with Bailey to Gordon Forbes and Selina Naudé, from them to Johnson and Klaus, and they decided that Klaus had to know about all this and her letter as well, because he had said, we know that you know, and I know about your little letter. After some initial embarrassment about the earlier lies and their reason for diving, there was no restraint left between them, and they talked freely and easily as old friends. Once, when the part about Selina Naudé came up, Kathy said that Rob's excuse had been a pretty lousy one, much to Rob's annoyance and Herbie's indignation. Recounted it word for word. Very late that night, after many brandies and continuous talking, they were finally satisfied with their future strategy planned. They were not exactly sure what they were up against yet, but at least they were alerted. An opposition was no longer a mere possibility, but a very dangerous reality. But the three were ready for anything, or so they thought. Chapter 6. Ashley Gordon Forbes was annoyed. Standing on the balcony of his suite on the 5th floor of the Beacon Island Hotel, he moodily stared out over the waters of Plettenberg Bay. His eyes occasionally strayed and strained in the direction of Cape Seal, impatiently searching for the telltale white speck. But even as he looked, he knew the futility of the gesture. The wrecker was still a day and a half away, and there was little else to do but wait. And it was this waiting and the frustrating efforts with the Moor women that were the main sources of his annoyance. So far, all their efforts had been fruitless. Thanks to the blundering attempts of Johnson and their newly acquired ally, Klaus Weber, the position of the Liberty was still unknown. But everything was not lost. Far from it. It would only take a little while longer to find the gold. The Moor women and the Dubois brothers were certainly working together. So all he had to do was to watch where they dive, move in with the wrecker and take over the show. But it would have been much more comfortable and less troublesome if Weber had had the sense of tactfully talk his girlfriend over to their side. Instead, not only had he alarmed her, he also drove her away to side with the Dubois brothers. He sighed and turned around. Some people just cannot think, he thought disgustedly. He should have come himself instead of sending Johnson ahead. He poured himself another whisky from the decanter on the table. Dropping 2 ice cubes in the raw spirits, he turned back to the sea, thoughtfully taking stock. Despite Johnson's failure with the goal, he had had some remarkable success though. He had made the right friends, left proper impressions and had prepared the climate to favour their operations. Upon his arrival a day before, he was met by a warm and friendly group. A quick assessment had assured him that Johnson had harboured considerable support for them and he could not foresee any problems ahead. That was except for the Dubois and the women. But what could they do? No, he assured himself, there was no way they could resist. And if they did, he would just naturally discourage them. There were many ways. The gold was his, and his alone. Having doubts, Selina Naudé had quietly appeared through the French doors, wearing an enchanting, colourful summer dress with thin straps over her slender shoulders. Auburn hair brushed loosely, she looked as bright and cheerful in the breeze as a bride on honeymoon. This was the first time Ashley had taken her anywhere except to his house. And in this romantic place with its sunny skies, it was as good as one. Their honeymoon, and she smiled with mystic remembrance of their earlier lovemaking. "Oh, Selina, you're a real cutie." He pulled her against his chest, feeling her nipples through the thin material of her dress. "No, I'm not having doubts, only contemplating courses of action." He saw her smoky, veiled eyes and felt the desire stirring in him as she sensually caressed his neck and back. She had the ability to drive him crazy. He covered her mouth with his, sliding his hands downwards in caress. Her mouth was warm under his, and without another word, he walked her backwards into the suite, and he gently pushed her down on the carpet and made love passionately. At that moment, the wrecker passed the lighthouse at Cape Agulhas in a heavy sea, and they were only doing 12 knots. She sank in the little less than 12 meters of water, quite deep, so I guess she didn't run aground. Maybe she was flooded and went down, but there was so little left intact that it's hard to tell. Still, there are many cannons and a lot of other brass. I've only dived there twice since I have found the bell, but I can tell you there are a great deal of things to recover apart from the gold, that is. I found the bell by pure luck and only after that recognized all the other derbies. Everything is overgrown with mollusks and seaweed. Seaweed. It's easy to miss or pass by. But then, she has been lying there for the last 190 years. Kathy paused breathlessly, cheeks flushed with excitement and eyes shining with enthusiasm as she leaned forward to make herself heard above the noisy spluttering outboard motor. She was briefly recounted her acquaintance with the wreck. Rob smiled as he listened, steering the dinghy according to her directions. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and he found himself looking forward to their first dive together and their first one down to the Liberty. He could hardly wait to start hunting through the wreckage for the precious gold coins. How many were there? And would it be easy? He shrugged. Only time could tell. The wreck lay further out than he had anticipated, although not far east as where they had previously dived. For the first time he thought the dinghy inadequate of the purpose. So far out, the little overload rubber boat was far from being comfortable as they bobbed along the surface riding the swells. Apart from that and Herbie's seasick face, the boat was too small for all the equipment. Usually crammed with the two of them, it was now crowded with the three of them and the equipment. Herbie was comfortably sitting in a bow and longingly stared back to the shore. Kathy was unconcerned, smiling faintly at Rob as she directed him into position. Glancing past his sun-bronzed and muscled upper torso at the eastern posts of the suspension bridge, she waited until it overlapped with a black streaked rock in a black ground, and then checked her second marker to the east. A little closer in, she called above the engine noise and watched the second marker. The yellowish trunk of the old wind-blown tree became visible between a grey overhang rock and a dense emerald green shrub. Stop! Rob flipped the throttle into neutral. This is it! Kathy glanced back at the bridge, then to the tree. A third marker was consulted before she nodded. Yes, this is it. Drop the anchor, Herbie. The anchor splashed overboard and Herbie let the thin nylon rope run through his hands. Once on the bottom, he gave another few meters and held on, feeling it scraping along the bottom, and hooked. She's firm. When we find her, we can leave a marker for the future, Rob spoke as he struggled into his wetsuit top. Kathy and Herbie, already dressed, donned the rest of the gear. Rob held both with their oxygen cylinders, grunting about the miserably small boat, wishing they had a large cabin cruiser to work from instead. From the bow came an agonizing groan. Startled, they turned to see Herbie hanging over the pontoon, retching furiously. For heaven's sake, get into the water before you have all of us sick in a moment, Rob growled as Kathy helped him with his cylinder, opening the air tap. Gratefully smiling at her through his mask, he tested the airflow from the DV. In the bow, Herbie plunged headlong over the pontoon into the clear water. Kathy fell backwards into the sea, with Rob following suit. With everyone seemingly satisfied and ready, Rob signaled down. Moments later, they finned down with air bubbles streaming behind and up to the surface. As they went deeper, the water became darker, but the visibility remained excellent, much to their delight. Rob watched Kathy as she swam confidently a little ahead. She didn't wear a hood, and her long hair fanned behind her in the water, while her wetsuit did little to hide those voluptuous buttocks and well shaped thighs. She graciously kicked with long straight legs, only bending slightly at the knees, leaving no doubt in his mind that she was no beginner. Her controlled breathing was further proof of her prowess, and the involuntary glanced sideways to Herbie. The latter was consuming air as if he was running a marathon. At least he was willing, Rob thought with a flash of sympathy as he remembered the horrible growling of his seasick brother. Kathy stopped them at 8 meters. 3 minutes, he signaled as he checked his watch. A slender white finger appeared and tapped his watch significantly. Glancing up, he saw a pair of grey-blue eyes mocking him from behind an orange-framed mask. No, he shook his head and held the watch in front of her as if to say, "Look, it's a Seiko Quartz Divers 150 meter. It won't rain out or drown. This one really works underwater." She laughed behind the mask, and spurts of air escaped the Devi as she chuckled. Rob felt strangely elated and happily comforted by her presence. This was the first dive since the hectic two-night days previously, when they had combined their knowledge and strength into a firm pact of the salvage and recovery of the treasure. After 2 days of relentless hard labor to update their neglected office work, Warden Opperman had finally succumbed to her anxious pleas for a week's leave on the condition that she would always be available when needed and back at work in time for the October school holidays. A condition which she had accepted gladly amidst Gabby's envious and Aunt Hertie's scrutinizing gazes. And now, on this bright Friday morning, she was leading them into the depths to a waiting fortune. Rob's watch was still operative after the 3-minute compression, and they continued the journey to the bottom of the weird silence of the deep. For countable minutes, they swam along the sandy, rock-scattered bottom, circling slowly out, their eyes reaching or searching endlessly. Suddenly, Kathy grabbed his arm, pointing to some obscure objects in the hazy distance. At first, it appeared indistinguishable from the rest of the ocean floor, but then, as they swam closer, forms began to take shape, and a song jumped to Rob's heart. They had found the resting place of the HMS Liberty. But that was about it. For the next 20 minutes, they crisscrossed the mysterious remains of a 2-century-old sunken warship, trying to evaluate and appreciate its lay for the subsequent reach or search during the days to follow. It soon became obvious to Rob that the greater part of the wreck was buried under sand, and when he signaled the group to the surface, his heart was heavy with doubt and misgivings. "I would take a tremendous and time-consuming effort to clear the sand away." For once, Herbie was the more positive one. He chatted excitedly as they sat smoking with wet fingers, while a slightly amused Kathy glanced from the salmon face of Rob to his cheerful brother, whose seasickness was gone and forgotten, at least for the moment. "That's no problem," Herbie pointed out when Rob expressed his doubts. "We can use a powerful jet of water." And when they stared up at him with puzzled faces, he explained, "A strong pump to produce a forceful water jet to blow away the muck, mud, and sand. That's the basic method to clear wrecks. Oh, yeah? And where did you learn about that? Well, I read about it. Herbie sucked on the cigarette while watching them thoughtfully. Actually, they used the screw of the salvage vessel to produce a powerful stream and direct it to the bottom by lowering a large horn-shaped pipe over the propeller. No forward dive, but enough force downwards to clear away the sand. Rob grunted. Why didn't you tell me this before? Well, I haven't thought about it. It came to mind when I saw the sight down there. He tossed the butt overboard. But the screw and horn won't work here. It's too deep, but a strong pump will do the trick. We will need a larger boat, Kathy pointed out, eating a piece of chocolate, and a very powerful one. Rob watched her admiringly, long wet hair plastered against her head and down over her shoulders, legs drawn up against her chest with a small square of chocolate delicately held between two fingers. She looked the angel of innocence herself, his heart squeezed with tenderness. We will have to hire these things, he mused, and she nodded. A fishing boat will do. We can anchor it here sort of permanently. Anyway, it would provide a far better and more stable platform than this dinghy. Sure was true. The dinghy was nearly too small now, and there would be no space for a pump. I agree, Herbie muttered and burped aloud from the Coca-Cola. I won't get sick on it. And Rob grinned knowingly. It will be worse. One thing for you. Drink those tablets I gave you. It works. His cigarette was finished and he watched his watch still going, and it was time to go down again. The last dive before the weekend, he said. So let's bring up one of those smaller brass cannons just for a start. And, nodding enthusiastically, they slipped on full cylinders, and moments later they were diving into the depths with long, powerful kicks. Upon reaching the bottom, Kathy led them to a barnacle and weed-encrusted object. It's one of the cannons, she signaled with hands moving animatedly. Using his large diver's knife, Rob did a quick inspection and nodded satisfied at Herbie, who secured the lifting bag to the uncomfortable piece of brass. Together, Rob and Kathy released air from their sets into the deflated oilskin bag until it filled out like a parachute. A little more air into the bubble to increase buoyancy, and the bag tore the brass cannon from the sand, starting slowly upwards. Thrusting the devies back between their teeth, expelling the water from the mouthpieces, they started up after the slowly ascending cannon dangling under the air-filled lifting bag. Soon the three learned that this was the easier part. To lift the heavy 4-foot brass cannon without a winch into the already overloaded dinghy was another story. But after several minutes of heaving, struggling and suppressing cussing, they finally managed to roll the heavy cannon aboard. In doing so, they nearly overturned the dinghy, half flooded it, but at least, with victorious grins and shouts of encouragement, Rob turned the bow shorewards. Their first day of working the wreck went considerably well under the circumstances. The brass cannon was extremely valuable, a taste of success. Next time down, it could be the gold. To the east and southeast, the sky was turning grey and the sea was steadily building up under an increasingly strong wind. Bad weather is on its way, Kathy warned, and with surprise they noticed that the sea was considerably worse than it had been half an hour earlier. Lifting the powerful binoculars to his eyes, the watchman saw the three divers disappear under the choppy surface for the second time. He grunted, satisfied. Going down at exactly the same spot was significant. They had found something, he thought as he lowered the binoculars. With his back comfortably against the rock, Bailey sat smoking patiently. For the past 3 days, he had come to the park early every morning, carefully watching the movements and activities of Cathy Moore and the Dubois brothers. And this morning he was rewarded when he saw the three leaving in the dinghy, all geared up for diving. He instinctively knew that this was the day. Selecting a scheduled spot from where he could watch them, he had patiently settled down with his binoculars. And now, 2 hours later, and with the second dive at the same spot, he was certain that they had located the wreck. He was glad to be out of that gloomy old library, glad to be part of the team of professionals who knows what they were doing, and his share would be terrific. More than he could ever make in wages at the library for 5 years, maybe even 10. Yes, he thought importantly, this is real life. He could do his part as best as possible. Bailey spat sideways and spat out a piece of gum as he noticed the telltale disturbance near the rubber dinghy. Lifting the binoculars to his eyes once again, he saw the divers bobbing on the surface, their orange buoyancy compensators unmistakably bright with another yellow object just below the surface. A yellowish ball. Puzzled, he stared, watching the frogmen awkwardly scrambling aboard. The yellow ball was now alongside. Straining his eyes through his optical aid, he saw the three divers. One was the Moor woman. Began howling the yellow thing over the pontoon, and it struck him like a bomb. They were bringing something aboard, something from the wreck, and in a brief moment of panic, he feared that it might be the gold. But his fears were mercifully unfounded, for moments later the oblong object appeared above the surface on the straining arms of the two men and women. Then, as it came aboard, the dinghy took water and was nearly unsettled. What the hell was that? Certainly no treasure chest. Through the powerful binoculars, he saw the encrusted, dirty object, watching it thoughtfully as the dinghy approached the river mouth. Swinging the binoculars back to the diving spot, he uttered a surprised cry. There, on the surface, bobbed a small marker buoy. The wreck on the old warship was marked. Warship, that's it. They had recovered a cannon. That was the final proof he needed and nothing more. Just as further precaution, he took a compass bearing of the grave of the Liberty. Half an hour later, on the western bank of the river, he took a cross bearing. Bailey grunted self-satisfied as he walked to his car. They didn't need anything from these three anymore. They had the position of the wreck, and as soon as the wrecker arrived, they could move in. 15 miles southeast of Mossel Bay, the 45-foot wrecker plunged ahead in a stormy sea. Each swell, which came over the bow, swamped the deck into a swirling mass of white water until it rushed back into the sea through the wide open scuppers. The powerful Mercruiser engines ran howling in the strong sea, straining the moment as the large cabin cruiser fought into and over a gigantic swell, the next moment revving free as she slipped down into the tuff. Braced with feet apart, Will Stein stood behind the wheel, contemplating the sea with a knowing eye. For the last 12 hours, he had been constantly behind the controls, battling the sea with growing uneasiness. Their situation had become more hazardous by the hour. The barometer was still dropping, predicting a continuous increase in bad weather and wind. He automatically ran his eyes over the control panel, taking it all in with a glance. He could judge the state of the boat and handle her correspondingly. The uneven strain on the engines worried him, and as they rode the wave, the needles of the tachometers shot upwards and he winched involuntarily. Although he could not hear them above the violence of the wind and sea, he knew they would be screaming agonizingly under the stress. But there was nothing more he could do to ease their load. He could only hope and pray that they might reach shelter soon. His eyes flicked to bilge pump lights. Both were glowing red as they had done ever since the weather had started to deteriorate 15 hours before. So far, they were keeping up. Thank God for a sturdy boat, he thought vaguely. He glanced at the uncovered radar screen. It was showing a continuation of white specks all around. The sea was too bad for proper functioning, but he kept on. An enormous wave bore down on the wrecker and Will watched in horror as it towered above. He saw the bow dipping into the wave. Shuddering, he frantically grabbed onto the wheel as the wave struck the wheelhouse with a jarring force that shook the boat, throwing him off balance. He lost his foothold and went down, but he clung to the wheel, keeping the bow into the sea. He struggled to his feet, ignored the pain where his back had hit the chart table. He guided the wrecker down, in the tuff. At that moment, he knew for certain that he was going to run for the protection of Mossel Bay Harbour. No matter how sturdy, she couldn't take many more like that one. Tony Fisher unsteadily came up from the saloon with a mug of coffee. He was pale and signs of weariness creased his thin face. Steadying himself with one hand, he passed the mug, only half filled to prevent spilling, to Will. God help us, he muttered, as he gloomily stared past Will through the window. Daar sê, môre is alweer Vrydag, dan lees ek verder aan The Long Lost Grave. Jy is ook welkom om boeke by my te bestel, by my e-mailadres wat onderaan al die video's verskyn. Dankie vir jou ondersteuning, finansiële bydraes en dat jy like, subscribe, share en die belbutton druk. Geniet die res van jou aand.